I'm talking about code generation, and it's kind of the theme for the evening. We've got 3 different kinds of code generation happening. Just a question before I start. Who isn't using GraphQL with some kind of code generation going on? A couple of people. All right. You'll be the recipients of most of the knowledge here. So what's awesome about GraphQL, it's sort of been around for, I don't know, 6 years now, 6.5 maybe, when the first spec came out. 8. I know it was 2015 when they open sourced it, right? It's making me feel old. Anyway, so the whole point of GraphQL was it was really designed for tooling. And before we had GraphQL, we had sort of REST APIs, which was some loose philosophy vaguely based around someone's, PhD thesis building, if you remember that world. And no one really interpreted the philosophy correctly, so everyone did it completely differently. So the main thing that GraphQL brings to the table is a very clear, open specification that is written down, and it includes strong types and the idea of introspectability. So you can introspect a GraphQL server, get all of its type information and API information, and do interesting things with that. So I think the killer thing was the introspectability. You can do lots of cool stuff with that. And you will see that within, GraphiQL and other tools. You can get documentation and type information and explore stuff just by asking the server what it can do. And it's open source as well, which is pretty great. So lots of people can contribute to it. It's not proprietary. The tool landscape's pretty huge. This doesn't even begin to scratch the surface, but we've got, I've misspelled graphical, API clients of various types. We've got lots of different things for lots of different client languages and view frameworks and all that. We've got API gateways coming up everywhere. We've got data engines, and I think my last thing has been clipped off. What was I thinking there? Hasura, Prisma, AppSync. I think I talked about that. There's lots of things happening there. But what's really useful when we have types is making sure that we have types, making sure we're correct from all the way in the server to our data, all the way to the front end and back and forth. So our GraphQL schema has strong types, as I mentioned. TypeScript has become popular in the last 4 or 5 years, and it has strong types. So what's really nice is if we have end-to-end type safety to make sure that if anything's, misaligned or mismatched, then we can understand through our compiling tools and other tools that we've got problems that we need to fix. So that's the dream. But doing this kind of strict typing with a lot of layers of database to server to GraphQL schema descriptions, and then also in the client, that's a lot of work to keep in sync, and it's pretty slow. And by the show of hands, code generation is the answer. So yeah, GraphQL code generator was the best we found. Has anyone found anything better than that? Because I think, oh yeah, put your hand down, Jed. Your talk's next. We looked at Apollo, and it actually turned out, I learned today that they had completely scrubbed the Apollo code generator because it wasn't very good when I looked at it a couple of years ago. And it still wasn't good a year ago, and they've completely abandoned it and just said, use GraphQL code generator. So it is sort of the canonical code generation tool. It produces pretty good types, and that was kind of the test when I was evaluating this. Does it give you good TypeScript types? I don't think it's perfect, but it's pretty damn good, and you're able to sort of work with it. There are a lot of configuration options, and it's changed significantly since I last looked at it. So I'm only going to scratch the very surface here and just tell you about some of the stuff that we've been doing in our projects and just do a little demo. So how do we use it? Basically, there's a CodeGen YAML file, which is the configuration. The basic kind of usage is specifying a source schema to introspect and generate the types from. You might be surprised to find that you also need a thing called operations, which is all of your queries and your mutations that your client's going to do. So if you're generating for a client, what you need to do is have a type for the query result and the mutation result, as well as what the schema actually gives you. So because you may query a different thing to what is possible. So you might only query a subset of fields. So that's quite important. What we do in our project was just have a GraphQL file. We outboarded all of the GraphQL into files on disk. So we had a whole sort of structure of GraphQL files. We had a GraphQL folder, and then we had our fragments, we had our queries in a folder, mutations, and so on. And that was very pleasant because we got, basically our GraphQL decoupled from our templates. So we could have used a different or generated a different view framework if we wanted to. So that's an important thing. And then there's a whole bunch of plugins that you can use with GraphQL Code Generator. I'll show you some of those, but the basic ones are, well, TypeScript generates TypeScript types for all of your types for your schema and your operations, and for whatever client library that you're targeting. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones, but check it out. So let's have a look at a demo. Where is Chrome? So I'm just using what's on the website because I was lazy and I didn't really want to write all of this. Did everyone see that? Okay. All right, I'm going to assume all the home users can see this as well. So what we've got is a pretty simple schema on the left.
Sorry, Josh, we can't see. We've still got the slide view online.
That was what I was asking. Let me stop that and reshare. Share that again. I probably should share my whole screen. Desktop 1, that's the one. How's that? Better?
Yep, that's great.
Cool. Can everyone read that? Yep. All right, so we've got a simple schema on the left. We've just got a query route over here, and a simple query with me as the user, blah, 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 some enums, an interface, etc. So we don't have any operations here. So this is like the simplest example. We just have to describe in the CodeGen YAML that we're using the TypeScript plugin. And what it's generating for us is a bunch of the types, the TypeScript types. So that's pretty much it. There's one there for every part of the schema. I don't think there's anything particularly exciting to point out there, other than you didn't have to write any of that stuff, which is the main point. What we can do with operations, once we start having GraphQL files included in the mix, then what we're saying is, well, this is what my client is actually going to query against the schema. And the combination of those things is described by this plugin. And then what it does is it starts generating types for essentially the return types for that query. So what you're going to get back from this is either the result or null if there was some kind of error and the server couldn't return anything. We've described the fragment there, but that actually isn't used, but you could use that and you don't have to write it. So the next thing that we used on our project was skipping straight ahead and using React Apollo hooks. And what that adds to the equation, you'll see that we kept the same schema, kept the same operations, and we've added the TypeScript React Apollo, which targets React and the Apollo client. And what that starts doing is giving us documents that we don't have to write, that are already turned into sort of GQL templates. And then it starts building your React hooks for you. So if you haven't seen that and you're writing your own, you might find a better way to do that with this stuff. So look, not having to write all of these and write all the types and do all the stuff is just such a time saver. And you can concentrate on solving the real problem. And I think you can see, and you can play around with this yourself, that there are many options in terms of different view frameworks. You've got Vue, you've got Angular, you've got Urkel. I've never used that. Has anyone ever used Urkel? No, but there's lots of options. There's React Query, which is another way to do it that isn't Apollo, and so on. And you've even got other languages as well. You've got Apollo Android. I don't know why iOS isn't in here. That seems like a bit of an omission. But you've got all kinds of generations you can do. It's pretty handy. So check that out. It's the URLs here. Just search GraphQL CodeGen and you'll be good. So what did we learn using this in practice? Configuration for what we were doing looks like this. So we've literally we had a client that was tied to the server. So we were sort of the only client. So we were able to effectively do this locally. But if you are targeting a schema you don't control, you can put that in here. We specify a glob for all of the GraphQL files on disk. So that hoovers up our whole GraphQL directory, gives us all our fragments, queries, and mutations, and whatever else is in there. And then, as we saw, we've specified the plugins, and this is the JSON file that's produced by the introspection. So pretty simple, but I've had a look, and since I last looked, there was a lot of configuration options. So read the docs, they're pretty good. I think I've talked about this, but I think it's worth mentioning it again. Outboarding the GraphQL files to disk allows you to decouple anything you're doing in your Vue framework from the GraphQL queries that are happening. So you could switch from React to Vue or do whatever, switch to a different Apollo client or use a React query if you like, without changing any files. So that's kind of nice to see all of your GraphQL independent of anything else that you're generating client-wise. We used fragments a lot, and I think with any significantly, complex kind of set of schema and query set, you're going to have lots of duplication. So use fragments to reduce that. Annoyingly, we ended up getting a fragment because of the way the code generation worked, and we had to work around that by doing some type aliasing. So we had a shared types TS file that used the generated result of types, and then did any aliasing and tidying up. Don't be tempted to change the generated file. That would be a little bit crazy, and I had heard of people doing that. That's not a good idea, because you'll be in a world of hurt. So you can tidy stuff up afterwards in a type file that references the generated file. Yeah, also, if you do change how you're querying an object and you need to add a field to a thing, changing one fragment in one place and having it used in all of the places that it ends up being referenced in is a time saver. And for anything significantly complicated, you're going to end up with a fragment being used at least a few times. What was this one? I think this wasn't my issue, but it's something that happened. The way Apollo caches objects that it fetches, it defaults to using an ID field, so that if you don't have an ID field specified on your object, your GraphQL object, you do need to actually configure Apollo to tell it what the unique key is. So that's a bit of a gotcha if you want caching to happen automatically in Apollo. Also, I did do this on a different project, which was using Dado CMS, and that was a schema I did not control. And this was for building our Alembic website. And the fact that I couldn't control the schema made it kind of annoying because the types did not generate correctly. So be aware that if you don't control the schema to a reasonably granular level, you're going to have maybe some type problems if it's been modeled poorly. And I resisted the temptation to write a intermediate GraphQL schema to wrap the Dado CMS, only because I didn't have time. But I think that was really the only solution. Either they fixed their crappy schema, because what it did was it exposed private things or stuff that it shouldn't, and I can't remember the exact details, but it was really annoying. It gave me poor types and it wasn't what I wanted. So the only real solution was they fixed the bug, or I had to produce an intermediate schema that gave me better types. So in conclusion, GraphQL is pretty good at supporting all kinds of tooling. You're probably all aware of that. Stop writing boilerplate and generate stuff where you can. because, you know, the type safety is excellent and it will tell you when things are wrong. And that is a very useful thing. And yeah, it's worth spending the time up front, making sure that the schema is generating useful types. So it may be a large schema if you haven't done it before. It's worth making sure those types are good before you start pouring the concrete and cementing in what those are, because changing it later is going to be challenging because you're going to start relying on those types. And if they're wrong, you're going to have problems. So spend the time up front. And then, yeah, end-to-end type safety is certainly going to save you a bunch of time and headaches. And that's all I've got. Thank you. Any questions on any of that, or, you know, any experiences that anyone else wants to share about what they've done with generation? Or the win. Have you never seen that? I feel like you've not been on the internet for the last 5 years. I always thought, actually, when I didn't know what it was, I thought it was WTF backwards. Yeah. I don't know, but the docs are good. I don't remember because it was the last time I used it was actually 6 to 12 months ago. So it's been lost to the mist of time. But yeah, Apollo is certainly, it wasn't producing the right kind of types and it never really got good. And they've just literally just learned this afternoon that they put their hands up and went just use GraphQL code generator. So yeah, move over if you're stuck on Apollo. It's just not good. What were the annoyances that you found?
All of the result types are a union of all possible types.
Right.
And doesn't automatically narrow it, even though you've got a right side, and it basically depends on why wrapper around the follow use the node one, so it automatically found the right time. You had to annotate 5 minutes.
Yeah, it was annoying, and it never quite got there. And I'm glad they've finally put their hands up and did it, but it took a while.
Does it do the same node?
Yeah, look, I mean, we didn't have any major dramas with it. The only annoying thing was that fragment. It was generating an extra fragment, but if you took the fragment off, it would look the same as the object that you were trying to do a fragment for. So that was a bit weird. I don't know if they fixed that in any way, but you know, all we did was just type alias the thing back to what it should have been, and that was fine. It was a bit annoying, but it wasn't a drama that you couldn't work around. Yeah. So I will go back to that because that when I discovered that, I was like, oh, I'm sold. Like, you've written all my hooks for me. So thanks for that. Yeah, so these are the hooks here. Can you see that? Yeah, it's got all of the arguments there and all of, yep. Find user query, and it's just generating all the hooks for all the operation queries that you've got over here. So these would be one operation typically per file. I mean, you could chuck them into one big file, but that's not very helpful. No, pull them out into their own fragment file in a fragment folder, because if you want to use them elsewhere, you can't. I don't think, because then there was an ordering thing. I think I don't know if they fixed that, but it was the way it loaded it up. If you had a reference to a fragment that you hadn't loaded yet, I think it broke, if I remember correctly, but I may be misremembering. But yeah, it's sort of nice to have all your fragments out separately. It's a little bit more work, but it's going to get big for any reasonable client that you're building. So yeah, I think if you didn't spot that it's actually generating all the hooks, that's kind of like the game changer right there. And that's generating it from the operations. Any other questions or observations? Is everyone using GraphQL CodeGen? Mostly, some nods, some shakings of heads. But I think there isn't anything better out there. Although Jed might disagree, but he can do that now. Thanks, everyone.